Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back at Notre Dame, and especially in such distinguished company, and with such old friends as Phil Munoz here, and good friends. And I wanted to thank Anna Bradley and Kathleen for that nice introduction, and Tyler, who's been very essential in moving me around from place to place, and Phil, who is the director of this whole wonderful operation. Now, Phil mentioned, or maybe Kathleen mentioned, that one of my early books was a book on modern American conservative thought, which is sort of a greatest hits package that I edited with Bill Buckley a long time ago, in 1988. Bill was still the editor of National Review then, and we used to bring him to campus frequently, where he would see young, promising scholars and even conservatives like Phil, and Phil's roommate, who is now the distinguished Father Dominic, the head of the Thomistic Studies Center at Catholic University. In those days, he was just a civilian and just an undergraduate. But the last time I saw Phil's roommate, who became a priest later, not all of his roommates have become priests, but there does seem to be a cause-effect relation of some kind. Father Dominic told me a story he had told Bill Buckley when he first met him in the Athenaeum at Claremont McKenna, at the little college where they were undergraduates, and I was and still am a teacher. And he came up to Bill Buckley at the reception at the Ath, and he said to him, with a sort of big smile and glow on his face, "Mr. Buckley, I think of you as the penultimate debater." Of course, unfortunately, Phil didn't know that penultimate didn't mean what it sounded like it might mean. And so a wary Bill Buckley leaned back and said, "Oh, and who is the ultimate debater?"
I didn't say Dominic said that.
No, didn't I say Dominic said that? He told me the story about himself. So that sounds like a very priestly thing to do. And I assume he told the truth about himself, at any rate. But anyway, it is good to be here and to talk a little bit today, in the little time we have this afternoon, about editing the Declaration of Independence. I'll get into this theme of natural right and political right a little later on, but I want to talk mostly about the actual process and the issues raised in the editing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, you might ask, why would I be interested in such a topic? Well, it is perhaps a sufficient answer that for almost 25 years, I have been the editor of a magazine, of the Claremont Review of Books, and so I have acquired an occupational bias. I do think it would be a better world if we had more and better editors. Without editorial authority, book publishing, journalism, politics, and the web have become anarchical, and I would say increasingly ugly. Without editors, the world grows hyper-Protestant. Every man his own priest, but also his own editor or non-editor. The world becomes all id and very little ego and super-ego. Editors are not perfect, of course, but at their best, they introduce an element of reflection, circumspection, and regard for the audience and the argument that even the best authors could use from time to time. Even Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, as he styled himself on his tombstone, one of the 3 accomplishments of his life he thought worthy of being remembered on his tombstone. The other 2, in case you're wondering, were author of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom and father of the University of Virginia. So 2 authors one of the Declaration, one of the Virginia Statute, and one father of the University of Virginia. He omitted from his tombstone a whole list of other offices which we might think naively would have qualified for remembrance. President of the United States, Vice President of the United States, Secretary of State, Governor of Virginia, and many more. No word breathed on his final tombstone on any of those fronts. Just the three things that he picked out as truly important from a long and very busy life. This is very different, by the way, from Benjamin Franklin's last will and testament, in which he lists every office he ever held from the least important to the most important, so in a wonderful sort of long stack. But properly speaking, still, Thomas Jefferson was not the author of the Declaration of Independence, but the draftsman of the Declaration of Independence. It was an official paper of the Second Continental Congress, and he wrote it for them. He refrained from using the definite article and calling himself the author because he served on a committee. He was one of 5 members of the committee appointed by the Congress to draw up a draft Declaration of Independence, or Declaration on Independence, as it was briefly called too. The Congress then took that draft and edited it again and ratified it. Jefferson didn't call himself the principal or main author either, presumably because, as Thomas Hobbes wrote, shared honors are diminished. So he left it at the proud but somewhat ambiguous or even misleading author of the Declaration of Independence. To be fair, Jefferson was not always so possessive about the authorship. In his famous letter commenting on the subject, he wrote to Henry Lee late in his life, May 8, 1825, late in Jefferson's life, the following famous short letter, which I'll take the liberty of reading. Quote, "All American Whigs thought alike on these subjects. When forced, therefore, to resort to arms for redress, an appeal to the tribunal of the world was deemed proper for our justification. This was the object of the Declaration of Independence. To place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we were compelled to take. It was intended to be," he went on, "an expression of the American mind, and to give that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then," he concluded, "on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc." Unquote. So this is a famous, if somewhat elliptic, description of where the Declaration of Independence came from and what it was trying to do. Among other things, those 4 names do not deflect attention, they call attention to themselves. Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. There's really a 5th name. And so you have 2 ancients, you have Aristotle and Cicero, a Greek and a Roman, and then you have 2 moderns, 2 Brits, John Locke and Algernon Sidney, who died a martyr to the Republican cause in the late 17th century. So you have 2 ancients, 2 moderns, you have 2 foreigners, you have 2 Brits or people from the same British political culture and heritage as Jefferson himself was. And how to understand this list, this combination of elements has bedeviled interpreters for many, many decades. And we may, in the questions, we might want to look into that a little bit. But one could say that there is one element of commonality which is apparent. All four of these famous men are Republicans with a small r. They are either anti-monarchists or they're anti-tyrants. And they're very interested in the kind of public life that can be led in freedom and in the responsibility of citizenship, to use one term that this center is dedicated to and that Jefferson was too. So the story of how the Declaration was drafted and edited has been well told, so far as we understand it at least, for there are still things we don't know. Told most of all in two books, one a very old book by Carl Becker from 1922. He was one of the greatest of the progressive generation of American historians. And 75 years later, the second really interesting book on it by Pauline Maier, called American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence. So that was 1922 for Becker, 1997, for Pauline Maier. What I would like to do is to ponder the significance of Jefferson's draft and of the editorial changes to it that yielded the official text, especially the significance of both for the understanding of natural right and political right in the American Revolution. So I'll come around to these larger theoretical questions, but first I want to talk about what was actually transpiring in the committees. The Committee of Five, appointed by Congress to draft a Declaration of Independence, comprised Jefferson, his friend John Adams, later his enemy, but finally his friend again, the old and very gout-ridden Benjamin Franklin, who was in such pain that he couldn't attend the Continental Congress or the committee for probably 4 of the 5 days or 4 of the 5 sessions that he was supposed to be there, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. So a kind of geographical range, as one might expect from a political operation like the Continental Congress. The Committee of Five left no minutes of their meetings, for which we must rely on later accounts, mostly between 25 and 50 years later, contradictory and incomplete by Jefferson and Adams, principally. Let me give you an example. In his autobiography of 1805, so quite a few years past 1776, John Adams said the Committee of Five had deputed a subcommittee of 2, Jefferson and himself, to prepare a first draft. Adams then persuaded Jefferson that the Virginians should take the lead. So that in the subcommittee, the 2 debated this, and it was agreed that Jefferson would take the lead. In 1823, so much later, the 80-year-old Jefferson remembered it differently. The Committee of Five met, he recalled, and unanimously pressed on myself alone to make the draft. He consented, he said, but before sending his draft to the committee, he sent it separately to Dr. Franklin and Mr. Adams, requesting their corrections, because, Jefferson said, they were the 2 members of the committee whose judgments and amendments I wished most to have the benefit. Their alterations came quickly, but were 2 or 3 only, and merely verbal. All right, so you almost couldn't differ in the description of what happened between the 2 men who were there. Was there a subcommittee of 2, or was there never a subcommittee, only Jefferson from the very beginning? Now, some of the most improving and memorable changes to Jefferson's initial draft were certainly carried out by his own hand, and we have a draft of it so we can see his handwriting and tell more or less who is doing the changes. Before sending the draft to Adams, Jefferson changed, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." To read, of course, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." That changes in his hand. There is there's a rumor going around that the suggestion was changed or was offered by Benjamin Franklin because he liked the word self-evident and had used it several times before, but we don't really have any confirmation of that. As far as we know, I mean, Jefferson could have entered the suggestion from Franklin in Jefferson's own hand, but the only thing we know for sure is that it was written in Jefferson's own hand, so we don't know the origins of it exactly. Self-evident is better than sacred and undeniable because self-evident is stronger, shorter, and more specific, connecting to Aristotle's logical writings and to the definition of a self-evident truth as one in which the meaning of the predicate is contained in the subject. This is as old as the hills. This has been, the history of logic since Plato and Aristotle at least. And so connecting to that tradition and to that tradition of meaning by which a self-evident truth is not just an obvious truth, but you might say it's a species of an obvious truth. It's an obvious truth that carries its own evidence in the terms of the proposition. For in the predicate, created equal, is already implied in the subject, all men, all human beings, that is. So self-evidence seems to have been a remarkably well-conceived improvement. Subsequently, Jefferson cleaned up the rest of that sentence, which initially stated that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive equal rights, some of which are inherent and inalienable. This is all Jefferson. And as you could tell, it's wordy. I mean, he doesn't use one word where he can use two in this sentence. There are too many equals there, and men, I would submit, are better off being endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights than deriving those rights themselves from their equal creation. That's a little chancier or a little less impressive. Plus, in the expression equal and independent, independent doesn't really add anything to created equal. And besides, after self-evident, the paragraph doesn't need a second word ending in dent, so self-evident, independent. Now, it was the Continental Congress itself, meeting as the Committee of the Whole, that performed the most extensive editorial work on the Committee of Five's draft document. The Congress pored over it for 3 successive days, whole days, or almost whole days. Several paragraphs were greatly altered, and a few, fully a quarter of the text, according to Pauline Maier, was omitted altogether. She judges it one of the most successful exercises in group editing of all time, and I would agree. Jefferson, however, did not see it that way, decrying the Congress's depredations, his word, and taking the occasion to record one of the classic stories about Benjamin Franklin, who was sitting nearby Jefferson in Independence Hall. Franklin perceived, Jefferson later recalled, quote, that I was not insensible, unquote, to the Congress's mutilations. I have made it a rule, said Franklin, whenever in my power, to avoid becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body. I took my lesson, this is Franklin speaking to Jefferson, I took my lesson from a young friend, an apprentice hatter who was about to open a shop for himself. His first thought, my friend's first thought, was to have a fine signboard made with these words, John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money. That was his friend's idea. So his friend asked his friends for their amendments. The first suggested he drop the word hatter as redundant with makes hats. The second proposed that the word makes should go too, since the customers don't really care who makes the hats as long as they're of good quality and to their taste. So John Thompson struck that word too. The third friend noted that for ready money was useless because no one in the town was accustomed to buying on credit. They expected to pay. So the sign now said, John Thompson sells hats. Sells hats, the third friend asks. Nobody would expect him to give him away, to give the hats away. So ultimately, the sign said simply, John Thompson, accompanied by the painted image of a hat. So that's a marvelous Franklin story, suggesting the former printer's appreciation of the ruthless business of editing. At the same time, it was advice to his young friend Jefferson to beware of expecting an author's satisfaction from a draftsman's job. And it was a lesson in the relation between nature and convention, which would be typically Franklin, who's a kind of philosophical character. So it wasn't necessary, you notice, to advertise that a hatter makes hats for humans, and not for other animals, or that one hat per person is the standard issue. These are things which if you know what a human being is and what the capacities and so forth of a human being are. What kind of conventions do we need? One hat per head is a pretty good convention to go by. Nor did he have to say that the image of a hat on the signboard was not meant to advertise the only model of hat that John Thompson produced and sold. That the image showed one of an infinite, or at any rate, very large number of hats of various sizes, colors, patterns, and styles that could be purchased or commissioned therein. So all of this was to Jefferson's benefit somehow, according to Franklin, or at least that's the presumption, and Jefferson thought well enough of it to record this story in his sort of autobiography of those years. Now, the majority of the Congress's editorial changes to the Declaration concerned the long central recitation of the charges against George III, attempting to prove that he had, quote, in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states, and that, quote, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people, unquote. It is these mutilations to the charges against George III, including the wholesale striking of Jefferson's long paragraph on the evils of the slave trade, with which Jefferson was presumably struggling when Franklin noticed his friend's unease. These were the words on the Declaration's signboard that the Committee of the Whole wanted to so blithely expunge. These were the deletions Franklin was endeavoring to reassure the suffering author were not as ruinous as he feared. One can sympathize, and should, with Jefferson's concern. He had arranged the Declaration as a kind of legal and political brief, beginning with a statement of the relevant laws, in this case the laws of nature and of nature's God, the Americans' rights and duties under those laws, the willful injuries against those rights and duties by the king, that's that long central section, and culminating with the injunctive relief that the Americans were seeking, to sever the political bands linking them to the British and to be recognized as free and independent states, conducting a just war for independence against the tyrant who intended to oppress them. Neither the Congress nor the Committee of Five had altered the basic structure of the Declaration's argument as Jefferson had conceived it, even though, as Franklin perhaps indicated gently, they found the argument a little overdone. Although John Adams said that he liked the flights of oratory in Jefferson's draft, including what Adams called the vehement Philippic against Negro slavery, meant to be the crescendo of the case against George III, Adams much later admitted, 1822 we're now talking, quote, there were other expressions which I would not have inserted if I had drawn it up, particularly that which called the king tyrant. I thought this was too personal, for I never believed George to be a tyrant in disposition and in nature. This is Adams. I always believed him to be deceived by his courtiers on both sides of the Atlantic, and in his official capacity only, cruel. I thought the expression by Jefferson too passionate and too much like scolding for so grave and solemn a document. Still, Adams did not object to the language either in the Committee of Five or in the Committee of the Whole. Though the king may not have been a natural tyrant, he was acting the part rather convincingly, Adams suggested, so much so that rebellion and independence were necessary. There was no other choice, and that certainly was Adams' opinion as well as Jefferson's. The Declaration's need to arraign George III's character as tyrannical depended, of course, on the implicit refusal of both the drafting committee and the Second Continental Congress to follow Thomas Paine's argument in Common Sense, which had just been published in January 1776. We're now talking about July. Paine had excoriated both hereditary monarchy as such and the mixed regime of the British Constitution in particular as reactionary, irrational, indeed evil. For Thomas Paine, one didn't need to prove George III a tyrant. It was enough that he was a hereditary monarch, the effectual truth of which was tyranny anyway. Common Sense attracted, as you may know, hundreds of thousands of readers in America, but not one vote in Congress. The Declaration, therefore, could not rely on an argument against monarchy in the document. It doesn't make an argument against monarchy. It makes an argument against the former king who is now a tyrant. The Declaration, therefore, had to prove or illustrate this long train of abuses and usurpations of which George III was guilty, which had the effect of degrading him from a king nominally seeking the common good of his people to a tyrant out to pursue his own good über alles. Both the drafting committee and the Congress accepted Jefferson's other rhetorical and constitutional presumption as well, namely, and this one is less obvious but just as important, namely that the only legitimate connection between the American people and the British Empire ran through and had always run through the king alone, not merely George III, but his predecessors, each of whom had used his prerogative powers to extend the empire's military and commercial protection to the colonies in exchange for their pledge of obedience to him as the head of the empire. Even though a lot of ink had been spilled by the Americans, filibustering against taxation without representation over the past 12 years, Parliament's asserted right to tax the colonies matters very little to the casus belli that's outlined in the Declaration. Jefferson had been arguing this way for at least 2 years since his pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, came out in 1774. James Wilson had come to the same conclusion, and the Continental Congress did too eventually, though with greater reluctance. Hence, the Declaration accuses the king of, quote, combining with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. The others referred to means Parliament, a term the Declaration refuses to dignify and so never even mentions it. They refer to them as others, as his countrymates and so forth, but they never use the term Parliament to refer to them. This means that the Americans had made an amazing about-face from what they had been arguing for most of the previous 12 years. The argument had, beginning with the Stamp Act and followed by the Townsend duties and all of the series of oppressive measures which we used to know as school children, or at least as high school history buffs. All of those arguments were directed against Parliament. This was a legislative body in which we were not represented. We didn't elect people to Parliament, and yet it continued to oppress us by passing taxes in our name as part of the British Constitution. Now, but this long-made argument has now been essentially pushed aside by Congress and by Jefferson. Our connection to England was always with the king and the king alone. It never ran through Parliament. Parliament does what it does as a tool of the king, and it's the king that has the ultimate authority for it and bears the ultimate consequences of their actions. That's where we are now in terms of the Declaration's argument. That's why every one of that long series of almost 20-some accusations against the king begins, he does, he passes, he makes happen, or he doesn't do things. He, the king, is the subject of every one of those clauses, or virtually every one of those clauses. But notice something about what the Declaration just said, that the king combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, small c, and unacknowledged by our laws. So, in this famous document, the meaning of natural justice or natural right is always seen in the context of our Constitution and our laws, and of the king's violations of those. By our Constitution with a lowercase c, they don't, of course, mean the later document we call the Constitution of the United States. This is 1776. That won't be written until 1787 and 1788, the following decade. By Constitution with a lower c, the Declaration means the British Constitution in America, or the joint Anglo-American constitutional order as understood and to some extent formally practiced in America. This, in other words, was an unwritten, or basically unwritten constitution, incorporating the legal habits of the empire until they were violated or contradicted by the pretended legislation of the parliaments, at least since 1763 or so. Our laws in the Declaration means especially the customs acknowledged and the laws passed by the colonial and provincial assemblies, defended by the Stamp Act Congress and by the First and Second Continental Congresses. In that sense, at least, the Declaration, for all of its obvious 18th century Anglo-American characteristics, deploys a kind of Aristotelian argument. In one of his more enigmatic passages, Aristotle, in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, defines political right as partly natural and partly conventional or legal, suggesting by this odd and interesting suggestion that in politics, natural right and conventional right come together, wrapped up in concrete political circumstances, in the laws prevailing in a country, in a regime or form of government, in the habits that prevail in the courts and out of the courts and so forth. You don't see natural right alone. You see natural right combined with many civil facts or conventional facts in a series of situations. The Declaration seems to argue that this suggestion of Aristotelianism, at least insofar as it moves, is its suggestion, at least insofar as the document moves from an account of pre-political natural rights, that is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to a defense of the right of the people as a collectivity to choose a new form of government in or through politics, which form not only secures their natural rights, but also embodies and enacts their opinion of what conduces to their safety and their happiness. There's a sense in which when you follow the Declaration from its starting point in individual pre-political natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when you follow them into politics, they become politicized. They become Aristotelianized, if you want to use a fancy term to it. And the opinion of safety and happiness is different from the pursuit of happiness or even from self-preservation. There's more content, there's more political opinion involved in saying when a people has a form of government that satisfies its safety and its happiness, its thoughts about safety and happiness. Something like this sense, I think, is what Aristotle would recognize as political right, meaning that the judgments of prudence are part of the political situation. They're part of the political right that you have to deal with. Prudence is not simply a calculation, let us say, from your anxiety at being killed or in dying a violent death, but there's actually a difference between how one understands situations as to what is the prudent thing to do under the circumstances that then prevail. That you have to know those circumstances to know from an Aristotelian point of view what's the right thing to do under those circumstances. The Declaration is very much similar to that. You can't know whether it's actually, you can know whether a government is, pinches or doesn't pinch against you, but whether it's prudent to overthrow it and to institute a new government is something very different. That's a judgment. That's a prudential judgment, which is not the same as a calculus or as some, a passion that you can't resist or can't reason with. So, in the 3 days it spent editing the Committee of Five's version of the text, the Congress tightened or moderated some of Jefferson's strictures against the king. They did the kind of thing which you might think Adams may have thought about doing but didn't do in the earlier committee. So King George III's actions put the Americans under, quote, the necessity which constrains them in the Declaration not to expunge their former systems of government, which is how Jefferson had it, but merely to alter their former governments. This is not a case of abolishing, much less, expunging. Expunge is one of those Harvard words. If you're an undergraduate at Harvard and you do something really naughty and you're kicked out, but it's really naughty. So you're not just kicked out, all evidence of your having ever been at Harvard is eliminated. That's called expungement in the Harvard Code. All references to you disappear. Your permanent files are no longer permanent, and they're not even anywhere nearby Harvard. So that's a really bad thing, and the government, what the king was doing was not expunging our local assemblies and Congress houses, but he was oppressing them, and therefore we had to alter them. We didn't have to start over again. We could start with what we had, but we had to alter them. Whereas Jefferson accused the king of, quote, unremitting, unquote, injuries, the Congress preferred repeated injuries. And it dropped the charge, which Jefferson loved, that the king's conduct contained, quote, no solitary fact to contradict the uniform tenor of the rest. So maybe there was a solitary fact which would contradict that tenor, but it wasn't that important. In one case, the Congress intensified Jefferson's charges. Jefferson had complained that the king was transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to America. That was an act, Congress added, quote, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, unquote. And totally, Congress's term, totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Thus, Congress emphasized Jefferson's own recognition that barbarism was possible even in very advanced or civilized nations and times, and Congress went beyond Jefferson's recognition by specifying that modern barbarism could be even worse than primitive barbarism. Above all, the Committee of the Whole balked at Jefferson's long discussion of the slave trade. So let me say something now about this issue. In notes made at the time, Jefferson blamed the decision on, quote, complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, which needed more slaves and wanted the slave trade to continue to flourish so that it could have more slaves brought originally into the United States. And also, Jefferson, in his notes, blamed it partly not just on South Carolina and Georgia, but on Northerners who didn't have many slaves, but who were, quote, pretty considerable carriers of slaves to others. That is, they owned ships and were in the shipping business. There seemed to be sufficient guilt to go around, in short, without coming to Jefferson's conclusion that the king alone deserved to be condemned for allowing the slave trade to continue. But that is the tack that Jefferson took. Quote, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, Jefferson declared, he being George III, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. This piratical warfare, pirate warfare, the opprobrium, this is still all Jefferson, the opprobrium of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative, that is his royal veto, for suppressing every legislative attempt by the Americans to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. Unquote. So that's a very strong, very powerful declamation, which Jefferson wrote. He defended it, he loved it, and it was entirely eliminated by the Congress, partly because of South Carolina and Georgia. There were two states who didn't want to see this attack on, it's really an attack on slavery and the slave trade. They sort of go hand in hand. Now, admittedly, it would have been nice in our contemporary debates over the 1619 Project and similar attempts to confuse our thinking about slavery and the founders if we could have pointed to words in the Declaration that explicitly identify blacks as men, capital M-E-N, by the way, in Jefferson's handwriting, as men, i.e. human beings, and that condemn slavery as unjust because it is an unholy violation of human beings' right to life and liberty. If we'd had that, it would have simplified the debates about the founders and slavery considerably. It wouldn't have solved them all, but it would have gone a long way in casting some welcome light on those controversies. Jefferson's words did all that. Jefferson's words said all that. And they would also have fed an interesting debate about Islam's responsibility for promoting slavery, since the infidel powers referred to in Jefferson's draft are, of course, mainly Muslims. But, it would have been interesting to have the distinction between infidels and Christians in the Declaration of Independence as explicitly as it was in its draft. But that George III deserved to be blamed for fostering the slave trade because he was a bad Christian king who wouldn't approve Virginia's and a few other colonies' efforts to outlaw or regulate the slave trade, nonetheless is a stretch. For one thing, it leaves out those states like South Carolina and Georgia who persistently preferred a more robust market in which men could be bought and sold. Jefferson was not finished, however. This is still from that draft paragraph. Quote, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he continued, he, George III, now is exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people among whom he has also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This is where it gets messy and complicated. So he's saying the king has sinned by dragging blacks from the coast of Africa into ships in inhuman commerce across the Atlantic and bringing them to chains, to slavery here in the United States. But he also sins by offering to free them from their slave chains if they will join his army in killing patriots, if they will join in murdering their former owners alongside the British redcoats. Here was an echo of the offer by Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, to free any slaves who would join the British Army's battle against the Patriots. You may remember that Nicole Hannah-Jones made a lot of hay from Lord Dunmore's offer in her introductory essay to the 1619 project. Despite the advantages that Jefferson's language would have brought to future discussions, the Congress was almost certainly right to strike the entire paragraph. It was over the top, too good to be true, too clever by half. Virginia was not responsible even partly for slavery and for the slave trade, according to Jefferson, but of course, Virginia was. They were the place the original slaves landed in 1619, and where a thriving commerce in slaves existed right down to the American founding. It was not that they were prepared, when they said, and they did offer as a legislature, to stop the slave trade, to stop bringing new slaves into Virginia. The reason they did so was because they had enough slaves. They didn't want the value of slaves to fall because so many more would be imported. Georgia and South Carolina still needed slaves. They weren't at a surfeit. And so they wanted fresh slaves brought in from the coast of Africa. But the difference in morality between the Virginians saying, we've got enough, thank you, and the South Carolinas and Georgians saying, no, we want more. There is a difference, but it's not a dramatic or it's not a good versus evil distinction, I would say, though Jefferson seems to pass it off as something like that. Nor does Jefferson hold America as a whole responsible for having slavery or the slave trade. All of that, too, is South Carolina and Georgia's fault. Before all, it was the king's fault. He saw to it that blacks were brought from Africa in chains, and then he offered to have those chains removed if only they would kill their former masters. Whether offering enslavement or emancipation, the king was in the wrong, according to Jefferson. The Americans were more or less innocent victims of his tyrannical ploys. Jefferson's interpretation of events came close to what today we would call virtue signaling. Whichever way the king turned, the king was on the wrong side of history, and Americans were on the right side of history. This point helps us, I submit, not only to understand the American Revolution and the founding, but also to understand how the consensus embodied in the Declaration of American Independence and later hailed in the Federalist as present in the Constitution could have been succeeded so rapidly by the bitter partisan battles of the 1790s. In 1776, there's a moment of a kind of consensus. In 1787, when the new Constitution is written and ratified, 1787-88, that too seems to be a moment of consensus or agreement in the American political system. 1788. And yet by 1791, Madison and Hamilton had long ceased being allies and were bitter political enemies of each other. Jefferson was a bitter political enemy of John Adams, his old friend, and also General Hamilton. And so, a partisan fire broke out in America very early in the 1790s from what had seemed to be very cold logs, you know, in the 1770s and the 1780s. How did that happen? Well, it's easy to read the later disagreements back into either the Constitution or, in our case, the Declaration. But I would not go as far as, say, Danielle Allen does in distinguishing what she calls the Adams Declaration from the Jefferson Declaration. I think she has succeeded in discovering later controversies in the 1776 text. Nonetheless, as these two great men approached the 50th anniversary of the document they had written together, and as they contemplated the prospect of their own death, the two authors and editors of the Declaration sized up its significance very differently. Permit me to close with this contrast. Jefferson's letter to Roger Waitman, June 24th, 1826, declining due to ill health his invitation to visit Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 1826, for the 50th anniversary, that letter is well known. Jefferson saluted the Declaration with his characteristic faith or hope in human progress. May it be to the world, he wrote, what I believe it will be to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. Jefferson says, all eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth, that is one that is so real you could touch it, the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few born booted and spurred, ready to ride them. That's a well-known statement of natural right, American style, even though that famous phrase about the mankind not being born with some with saddles on their backs and a few born booted and spurred, as if to ride them. That comes, of course, from, Jefferson remembered it from heart, from an old one-eyed 17th century Puritan revolutionary who was about to be executed at the end of the Puritan Revolution in the 17th century around, well, actually closer maybe to 1688, but close to that, in England in 1687 or so. So that's Jefferson's famous declamation on the subject. Much less well known is John Adams's reply to a Mr. John Whitney, June 7th, also same time, 1826. Both this is as the July 4th anniversary is coming up, who had been invited, Adams had been invited to a similar celebration on the anniversary of the 4th in Quincy, Massachusetts, just down the road from him. Adams declined to attend for the same reason as Jefferson. He was old and sick, and he couldn't make it. But he left this tribute, just as Jefferson left those sentences to be read, so Adams left his own. Here's Adams' shorter eulogy, as it were. The 50 years since independence, he hailed, are, quote, mark a memorable epoch in the annals of the human race, destined in future history to form the brightest or the blackest page, according to the use or the abuse of those political institutions by which they shall, in time to come, be shaped by the human mind. Here we have a very different reading on what natural right implies, even if what it means is they're fairly close to each other. But in Adams, there's no promise of worldwide liberation or enlightenment. No suggestion that palpable or scientific truth could come to the rescue of self-evident or moral truth. No claim that the human mind would prove permanently or inevitably progressive. No claim that there would be a happy ending to the human story. but instead a sober prediction that the future will be very much like the past, open to use and abuse, to virtue and vice, and hence to both good government and misgovernment. No direction in history that can be relied upon by us to make sure that will ensure that the good guys win or that human rights and not the opposite prevail. Same Declaration of Independence, same Committee of Five, same allegiance and, broadly speaking, an understanding even of natural right, but very different political coloration, very different valuation, you might say, on the same facts. And for students of American political ideas, it's one of the great questions to be answered. How do we get from this relatively optimistic and sunny period in the 1770s and 1780s to the all-out partisan warfare of the 1790s, which is very much like our America today in its bitterness, in the personal attacks going back and forth. Jefferson is being alleged to be an atheist by the Federalists. Adams is alleged to be, and Hamilton are alleged to be secret monarchists, plotting to bring back the King of England and the monarchical system in America and to overthrow Republican government completely. Not all that different, really, from Save Our Democracy in today's political fulminations back and forth. But how did we get there? How did we launch American politics after this sort of wonderful prelude? How does it launch in the way it does? And how do we get, of course, today here, where we are now, with an election about a month away in front of us all? Anyway, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. And we have a tradition here. We let our undergraduate students, Isabella, why don't you head to the back and I'll just put the question.
Stand up. Oh, it's a lot of exposure. My name is Isabella Rempel, and I am a sophomore here at the University of Notre Dame. I study classics and also environmental science, and I am a Con Studies minor. Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Dr. Kesler. This was very interesting. I had a question about some phrases that you brought up, especially in Jefferson's letter to Waitman, and a phrase here that I found in the Declaration of Independence. And you said that in the letter to Waitman, Jefferson wrote that men bind themselves. So it's almost this action of they cannot get out from under something, but that it's intentional and they do it to themselves. It's not passive, it's active on their part. And then here in the Declaration of Independence, he says, mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves. And to me, if I look at our current political situation, those observations of human nature are very concerning. What does that mean for our government? What does that mean for our republic if most men are unable to protest against things that they find to be oppressive? What is that? That seems to me to be very dangerous and to be a very negative aspect of human nature that could really, in essence, destroy our government.
Well, good. Thank you, Isabel. That's a great question. In a way, the two excerpts from Jefferson drive you to Adams. In a way, Adams says, it's all in our head. The errors of opinion, suspicions, the kind of political shortcuts that people take with their former friends and former political allies when conflict becomes hot enough or the stakes become high enough. Who wouldn't regret, in some more impartial forum, who wouldn't regret the kinds of illusions that people bind themselves to and bind themselves under? But the difference between Adams and Jefferson is Adams doesn't think there's any cure for that problem, except in a way experience. And you know, there is such, he did write several large books, which he intended people to read and get a shortcut onto experience so that you could learn something at someone else's pain instead of only from your own pain and experience. He wrote something called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. This was when he was in France as a diplomat, Adams, that is. And it's a very long three-volume work, which is not a defense of the U.S. Constitution, which hadn't been written yet, but a defense of the state constitutions that had been written in the 1770s and mid-1780s. And it's a wonderful, if tedious, work. You know, it's full of 18th century excerpts from other books. By 18th century attribution, I mean sort of like, you know, the president of Harvard. It's there are no footnotes. There's no attribution. So you will find yourself reading Adams's book, and you'll read something about, you know, the invisible hand, and you'll say to yourself, "Wow, that sounds like Adam Smith." Guess what? It is Adam Smith. You've just stumbled into pages of quotation from Smith's Wealth of Nations, or more likely the Moral Sentiments, incorporated in this megatext by Adams himself. A sloppy scholar, but an interesting thinker. You know, I think it's fair to say. But I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but I think that's, his view would be, you know, when he was vice president of the United States, and even when he was president of the United States, he was still writing for the newspapers. He was still writing opinion columns and political columns, but his are of a very peculiar kind. They're kind of philosophical. And so one whole series is written about Roman history, but with the names and the dates changed to contemporary American history. But the same kind of factional conflict, the same kind of clash between different opinions about what's right and what's wrong and who should rule in the name of what's right or what's wrong. And his point was the Romans are human and we're human, and our coming in the 18th century and their being coming at the end of the BC period doesn't change our nature. The problems of politics are essentially the same. In some ways they are worse because, or to the extent that the Enlightenment has created a false God or a false faith in super rationality as the way out of these problems. He never bought that. And Jefferson didn't exactly either, but Jefferson came a lot closer to it than Adams did, and so they fought over that. But they did, as I alluded to earlier, they did become fast friends again at the end of their life when they were both in their 70s and 80s. And they began to correspond after decades of never sending a note to each other. And so you have this marvelous efflorescence of friendship at the end of their lives when they're old men and they have similar problems and similar anxieties about what's going to happen to America. Both are very worried about the problem of slavery and of the Union. How do you keep the Union together when it's half slave and half free? And they're able to talk to each other as fellow authors of the Declaration of Independence in 1823, 24, 25, 1820, up to their death in 1826.
I know some of you have class at 2 and should leave momentarily. We'll go over a little bit of extra time if that's okay with Professor Kesler, because I want to get as many questions as possible. And I'm going to get my own question in here because I didn't follow everything. And so the theme or underlying theme was the relationship between natural right and political right. Natural right being more abstract, principles of justice, political right being how those principles are manifested here and now. And you connected that to the revisions of the
Yes,
Declaration of Independence.
right.
So, but what is there a dispute between Jefferson and Adams then on the relationship between natural right and political right? Was that the final point? Or could you maybe clarify what
I
the,
think there was always some disagreement about that combination of natural right and conventional right, which is political right. But they didn't have intense disagreement about natural right as such, about all men are created equal. That they both wholeheartedly believed, and that human rights and human duties are reciprocal, and that nobody has more or less than anyone else as far as that goes. Rational beings each participate in that same rational inheritance, or that same rational capacity. They agreed about that. What that meant for aristocracy in society, what it meant for the difference between the few and the many politically, is where they did disagree. And they never, in a way, they never disagreed enough to become bitter, enemies of each other, although they came close. But many people on their sides did, and did take the other side at its worst. But they were, there was a movement in that direction that was never quite consummated between the two of them. But fortunately, their differences were not so much over equality as such, but what else besides equality is needed in a decent society, or how much equality and in what form ought it to take. And this is, so, if you look at them as constitutional architects, the strangest thing about Adams is that Adams, Jefferson clearly feared the few and the one. These were dangerous to Republican government. He wanted the Senate to be as carefully handled as possible, and but he above all feared a president who could be reelected for his entire life and rule as a kind of king. Adams didn't really fear he feared everyone, but he especially feared the few and the Senate. And his weird argument was that what distinguishes the few from the many is the ability of the few to manipulate the many. And if you put all of the master manipulators in the same house, they're going to be nothing but trouble. So the Senate, as it was organized in the Constitutional Convention, he was more critical of than Jefferson was.
so would Madison be the one who feared the many the most compared to these two?
Yeah, well, he feared, he had his own career, so he certainly fears tyranny of the majority. This is, of course, his characteristic political contribution. But it's also the case that when he partnered with Hamilton, he feared it more. And when he partnered with Jefferson, he feared it less. And what he really feared was an anti-Republican movement emerging from within the bowels of American republicanism.
Let me ask a question that I think might help some of my students, or as anticipate, given our class conversations,
Yeah.
The question that some of the students might have in the back of their mind. So Jefferson has this paragraph condemning the slave trade and condemning slavery, cruel war against human nature. That's implicit in the language of equality, the self-evident truth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was there any discussion in editing of having some, if you can't blame only the king for the slave trade, could you just have a condemnation of slavery? Was that ever considered? Do we see anything in Jefferson's draft other than the paragraph that was excised? If it follows from the principles that are present, why not a more explicit condemnation of the practice of slavery itself?
the short answer is the easy answer, which is that neither Jefferson nor Adams thought that a simple condemnation would get through the convention. I mean, Jefferson's qualms about South Carolina and Georgia may have been correct, but when the general discussion comes up, there's a point at which the Continental Congress, before it goes to the committee to write the Declaration, raises the question of natural right. And in this debate, this interesting debate, it's a short debate, but Adams is part of it. He was part of every debate in the Continental Congress. He says that you can't. Now I've lost my chain of thought. What we were saying? Oh yes, right. Yeah. No, he says, we can't continue to rest our argument on the charters, on the chartered rights, or even on the British Constitution. We are now approaching the point of making a decision for independence. We have got to recur from these historic rights to natural right. And there's some flourish of attention in the convention, and no one really says no to it. I mean, you would expect maybe John Dickinson, but he doesn't. And so it proceeds, and they proceed to write a Declaration of Independence emphatically based on natural right, or beginning at least with natural right. So they could do that, but they couldn't also apply natural right to the abstract question of slavery.
Because of the brute slave interest that was in there.
Yes, because you wouldn't have gotten anything, and then that's what they feared. Yeah.
Let's try to get maybe short answers.
I mean, you could also say, more flippantly, what part of a self-evident truth don't you understand? I mean, because the defense of them would be, it's already implicit in the natural rights argument. We're not erasing the conclusion, we're just refusing to draw the conclusion.
As I said, if you need to go for class or other reasons, please do so. But let's get maybe short answers, and we'll get as many questions as we can. Okay, Eddie, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture today. I wanted to actually ask about one of the first things you said, the Jefferson quote about the four thinkers, Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc.
Right.
And how that's somewhat maybe bedeviling. I might have found myself a bit bedeviled because, taking a look at this list, well, the etc. itself, is sort of interesting. In addition to Sidney's inclusion in that list, which maybe to us, we might think, well, that might not be a thinker of the pedigree. Sidney might not be of the pedigree of an Aristotle, Cicero, or Locke. But that might be might just be our perception, and maybe he was for Jefferson or for some of the framers. But as well as what unites these four thinkers and whether or not they are Republicans or anti-tyrants, because, well, at least maybe to complicate things, Aristotle, for example, does seem to hold out for the possibility of an infinitely wise person to whom, maybe political rule should be accorded, and maybe that's one of the characteristic differences, we might say, between like an ancient political science and a modern political science. So maybe, among those few things, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to the quote and in some of the difficulties maybe associated with it, and what you think about that.
Well, let me just, in the spirit of the instruction I received, keep my answer short. Jefferson, especially in this period, almost never mentions Locke without mentioning Sidney. They're a pair, and they go together. And what does that mean? Well, they're both, they come out of the British constitutional conflict of the 17th century. They're both defenders of Parliament, broadly speaking, or against a tyrannical or tyrannizing king. Sidney is explicitly Republican. Locke is not explicitly quite Republican. He doesn't call himself that exactly. Sidney does. Sidney also unlike Locke, uses ancient sources throughout his work. So there's a lot of Cicero in there, there's a lot of Roman historians in there, there's a lot of Aristotle even in Sydney. And so they give you, if you put them together, you make the problem deeper and more perplexing, I think, because if, as we are sort of conditioned to think, it's ancients or moderns, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You've got to go with one or the other. The founders are fairly resistant, fairly stubbornly resistant against that tendency. And I would say one of the things I've learned in looking at this material for a long time is that there's a reason why in the 18th century the famous episode is called the Battle of the Books, because it's still a battle. I mean, that is some of the same people whom one might consider to be entirely partisans of Machiavelli or John Locke are not so certain when you look closely at their writings. And the same people can see something good in an argument from Bacon and yet also have many reservations against it from classical or Christian sources. And so in many ways, these are not finished issues, settled questions, and especially in politics where so much is always in motion. I think we should be more open to the possibility of smart people seeing some merit in ancients and seeing some contrasting but often complementary merit in moderns.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kesler. I was really interested in the rhetorical pivot that you mentioned among the founders regarding the abuses of Parliament to the Declaration, which pivots to criticizing the king. I'm not as knowledgeable on the subject. As a matter of British constitutional history, how much power did the king actually have over the grievances that were mentioned in the Declaration versus the Parliament? And I guess more importantly, what is the reason you think they make this rhetorical pivot? Is it to sort of prejudice the American people in a Republican direction at this point in time? What do you see as the reason for that pivot?
Well, I think the short answer to that is the dawning independence. In making an argument against the Parliament, you are involved in a lot of dusty precedents and treaties, contracts, charters, whereas the argument from nature, can be written as the young Hamilton says, as with a sunbeam. It's clear, it's pellucid, it's not polluted by precedent and by many iterations of similar arguments over the years. The difficulty, if you look at this a little bit more closely, if the charge against the empire is taxation without representation, then the obvious solution is, why not representation? Why not allow America to send some elected members of Parliament to Great Britain? Why not give us the vote? If our problem is not with taxes, it's with the lack of representation empowering taxes. So why don't we just empower representatives? And this is a suggestion that the Americans actually make in the beginning, but they abandon it fairly quickly. And the British were never keen on it. And the reason the British weren't keen on it is they have, America likes to think it's the only part of the empire. But in fact, they won a world war against France, in the 1750s, 1760s, and now they have to administer a world. They have to administer huge land acreage of countries, Canada, India, the West Indies, the Caribbean, British North America as well. And they have a lot of problems administering this sudden success they have scored in the war. And in a way, as often in life, your real problems only start when you get what you want. And when you win the war and you win it big the way they do win it, I mean, it was a complete disaster for France. You're tempted to do things which you probably shouldn't do. And the thing that British were immediately tempted to do was rationalize the empire. We can't let the Americans have their own little home form of government, their own assemblies and so forth. We're not going to let India have that. We're not going to let the West Indies have that. We're certainly not going to let Ireland have that. We're going to have to govern America on empire or imperial principles, just like we've governed Ireland, just like we governed the West Indies. It's going to be a much less participatory regime. It's going to be a more bureaucratic regime. And we're going to rationalize that form of government so we can just take people from one part of the empire, put them somewhere else to run a new part of the empire. That's how the colonial ministry thought about it. This was what they wanted to do. It is exactly the opposite of what the Americans wanted to happen. From their point of view, they are the real England. They voluntarily left England to come to the United States over many, many generations. And now they don't want to be ruled with the rights of Irishmen or the rights of Indians, who are no part of the political body of England, of the self-governing class of England. They don't want to be ruled by, a different class of people that they don't know, that they aren't friendly with, that they don't trust. And so when they look at this, they mess up in many different ways. They make mistakes that Americans immediately identify to them and complain about, but they never learn from their mistakes, essentially. And the Americans the Americans are not rebellious. They have to be talked into rebellion. From the very beginning in 1763, at the end of the war, Americans are happy, proud to be members of the British Empire. It's the freest empire in the world. It's the richest, most powerful empire in the world, and we're part of it. Over here just on the edge of a vast ocean and a large landmass over here, we enjoy the same Constitution that they do in glorious Great Britain. The Constitution celebrated by Montesquieu and countless British politicians and jurists. And so you would think that the two sides could have worked out some kind of representative outcome that would have taken the best of the British example and applied it to American circumstances, but they couldn't, and the empire itself got in the way. They couldn't give the Americans representation unless they made the whole empire representative, and they were certainly not going to do that. And so the Americans then, okay, if you won't give us representation, what will you give us? And for 10 years, the two sides went back and forth trying to figure this out. And nothing that they offered to give, and they made a couple of proposals, nothing that they offered was sufficient for us. And nothing that we wanted was, small enough for them. It's a great story, though, the whole back and forth between the mother country and the colonies. And of course, Benjamin Franklin was over there for a lot of this period. He was one of our main representatives to Parliament, one of the few people who could speak for us on the floor of Parliament if they permit him to come on the floor. And he was very reluctant to come to revolution, as John Dickinson and a lot of other people were. Not Adams. Adams was a firebrand from the very beginning, and Jefferson was easy to talk into it too.
I feel like the lesson of all this is you shouldn't necessarily treat all your children equally. Okay, one very quick question here that I can't resist but asking. I go back to your editor beginning, you as an editor.
Yeah.
What edits would you make to the Declaration?
I think the Congress actually did a pretty good job. I think they were right to strike the section about slavery, even though we lost a lot in losing it. I mean, it would have made our lives simpler. Maybe that's obviously too lightweight a reason, but still, they got most of the big things right.
Because it simply wasn't true what the paragraph. I mean, it
It
wasn't
was
really the king's
unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, the most effective response to the Declaration's idealism was the famous one by Samuel Johnson, paid for by the British ministry, by the way. Why is it that the loudest yelps for liberty come from the drivers of Negroes?
Reveals American hypocrisy.
Yeah. Why is it that it's these Southern guys like George Washington and others who have slaves who are complaining about their liberty when 1 minute of their freedom is completely incomparable to 1 minute of the slaves' oppression. But they're complaining about their rights, not the slaves' rights. And that's, so, I mean, I can understand why Jefferson wants to hit back against that charge, against the hypocrisy charge. But this is not an effective way. This is so complicated and so self-serving. Slavery, it's a terrible thing. It's the king's fault. It's not our fault in Virginia, maybe a little bit in Georgia and South Carolina, but certainly not here, not in America, I mean, he liked to use Virginia as a kind of symbol for America. This is in his one book on notes on the state of Virginia. Is not just about Virginia. It's a lot of it's about places outside of Virginia. So, he didn't see clearly, I think, how vulnerable the grandstanding morality would be, and how flippant the comebacks would be if he really pushed this line. But it's, I could still, Adams liked it. I mean, Adams actually liked that part. I don't know that he would have saved it from he didn't do anything to save it from that we know of, at least, from the Continental Congress. But as I said, we don't know, there's a lot of things we actually don't know still about the process of how things worked in the committee and even in the Continental Congress, because they didn't have minutes either.
I feel like we could go on for much longer, and maybe if there's a few more questions before Charles Kesler has to leave. Before he leaves, join me in thanking him for his
Thank you. Thank you all. Good. Fun.